Hola muchachos! In today's lesson we are going to look at a different way to talk about the past tense in Spanish called the imperfect. We will talk about when the imperfect is used to talk about the past in Spanish, as well as how to conjugate verbs in the imperfect tense. Be sure to take good notes so you can use them to help you complete the assignments that will follow this screencast. The imperfect tense is another way to express the past tense in Spanish, but how it is used is very different from the way we use the preterite tense to talk about the past. First, let's review the preterite tense and its uses in Spanish. We learned the preterite tense in 3 different steps. In step number 1, we learned when the preterite tense is used. Here is a quick review. The preterite tense is used in Spanish to talk about a completed action, an action that started or ended in the past, an action that occurred at a specific time, an action that occurred a specific number of times, or through the use of trigger words including ayer, anoche, un día, la semana pasada, or el mes pasado. Then, in step number 2, we learn how to conjugate regular verbs in the preterite tense by memorizing the preterite tense endings for AR, ER, and IR verbs. And finally, in step number 3, we learned how to conjugate verbs that had spelling changes as well as our irregular verbs in the preterite tense. You will learn how to use the imperfect tense in Spanish in the same way you learned the preterite tense. In step number 1, we will look at when the imperfect tense is used and what some of the trigger words will be. Then in step number 2, we will look at how the imperfect tense is formed for AR, ER, and IR verbs. And finally, in step number 3, we will look at the irregular imperfect tense verbs which you must memorize. Even though the imperfect tense is another way to express the past tense in Spanish, it is not used in the same way. The imperfect tense is used to talk about actions that do not have a specific beginning or end, or to provide descriptions in the past. The imperfect tense in Spanish can be used to express used to plus the verb in English. For example, if I wanted to say, I used to go to my grandmother's house every Saturday, I would use the imperfect tense in Spanish. In addition, the imperfect tense is used to talk about repeated or habitual actions, or to describe ongoing actions in the past. In English, we describe ongoing actions in the past by using the structure was or were plus ing. The imperfect tense can also be used to describe mental, physical, or emotional states of being. It can also be used to make general descriptions such as appearance, color, quality, etc. The imperfect tense is also used when you are making descriptions about time, such as telling what time of day it was, describing the day, stating the date, talking about someone's age, and also making descriptions about the weather. Remember, in Spanish, when we talk about age, we use the verb tener. Here are some words you might expect to see in a sentence that would require the use of the imperfect tense in Spanish. Generalmente or por lo general, muchas veces, siempre, todos los días, and a menudo. Treat these words like vocabulary and memorize them so that you can easily recognize when a sentence needs the imperfect tense. Now that you can see when the imperfect tense is used to talk about the past tense, let's move on to step number 2, how to conjugate a verb correctly in the imperfect tense. Similar to conjugating verbs in the present or preterite tense, you will start with the verb in the infinitive. Next, you will drop off the ending of the infinitive verb and add the appropriate imperfect tense ending. We will look at our AR verbs first in the imperfect tense. In order to conjugate a verb in the imperfect tense, you will use the endings aba, abas, aba, abamos, abais, and aban. Notice that the nosotros form does use an accent mark on the first A of the ending abamos. Let's look at an example using the verb hablar. In order to conjugate hablar into the imperfect tense, the first thing I do is I drop off the AR ending, and then I use my new imperfect tense endings. So hablar in the imperfect tense looks like hablaba, hablabas, hablaba, hablábamos, hablabais, hablaban. Verbs that end in ER or IR in the infinitive will not use the same endings as our AR verbs in the imperfect tense. Take a look at the endings that you will use in the imperfect tense for ER and IR verbs. We will use ia, ias, ia, iamos, iais, ian. Notice that all of the conjugations contain an accent mark. We will use the verb comer to look at what an ER verb might look like in the imperfect tense. Comer becomes comía, comías, comía, comíamos, comíais, comían. Remember to include an accent mark on all 6 conjugations in the imperfect tense. In our last example of regular imperfect tense verbs, let's look at escribir. Escribir in the imperfect tense will conjugate in the following way. Escribía, escribías, escribía, escribíamos, escribíais, escribían. Finally, let's look at step number 3, forming our irregular verbs in the imperfect tense. One of the nice things about the imperfect tense is that there are only 3 verbs that are irregular in the entire tense. So even if a verb is irregular in another tense, it will most likely be a regular verb in the imperfect tense. This also means there are no stem changing or spelling changing verbs that need to be memorized. You simply need to remember these 3 verbs. The first verb that is irregular in the imperfect tense is the verb ser, which means to be. In the imperfect tense, ser is conjugated in the following way. Era, eras, era, éramos, erais, eran. Notice that the nosotros form does contain an accent mark. You will need to memorize these 6 forms. The second irregular verb in the imperfect tense is the verb ir, which means to go. Ir is conjugated in the following way in the imperfect tense. Iba, ibas, iba, íbamos, ibais, and iban. And finally, the last irregular verb in the imperfect tense is the verb ver, which means to see. You conjugate the verb ver in the following way in the imperfect tense. Veía, veías, veía, veíamos, veíais, veían. Remember that one of the nice things about the imperfect tense is that there are very few irregular verbs. In fact, there are only 3 irregular verbs, ser, ir, and ver. While you do need to memorize these irregular forms in the imperfect tense, there are no stem changing verbs and no spelling changing verbs in the imperfect tense. Remember that the imperfect tense does not work in the same way as the preterite tense, even though they are both forms of the past tense. Let's look at the sentence, Yo comía las verduras. In English, that particular sentence can be translated by saying either I used to eat vegetables, I would eat vegetables, or I was going to eat vegetables. Here is one more example of what the imperfect tense might look like in English with the sentence Juan iba al parque. In English, we could say either Juan used to go to the park, or Juan would go to the park, or Juan was going to the park. Remember that the imperfect tense does not work the same way as the preterite tense. Now let's practice forming the imperfect tense in Spanish. Pause this video now and try to complete the following 5 sentences by conjugating the verb correctly in the imperfect tense. Now compare your work with the answers I have up on the screen to check and see how well you understand how to conjugate verbs in the imperfect tense. Gracias por tu atención hoy. Hasta luego.